We used to try to have people who were smart. And if they had principles, even better. You just don't get those people running for office anymore. People with principles do not want to be in politics. I think that's pretty clear.
Welcome back to this week's episode of The Feds, where we bring to public attention the experiences of those affected by unconstitutional and unlawful acts of the United States government. I am Stephanie Weidel. There are exciting new things happening with Feds for Freedom. Go ahead and check out our new Substack where you can stay up to date. One thing to note, we've got a dynamic FOIA team, which is getting back some shocking information. So go ahead and subscribe to our Substack to read all about it. And of course, visit our website and donate towards Feds for Freedom at fedsforfreedom.org.
Welcome to the Feds, insiders bringing accountability, integrity, and reform to a broken bureaucracy. At Feds for Freedom, we value constructive dissent and healthy debate. The views and opinions shared in today's episode are those of the speaker alone and do not express the views or opinions of the U.S. government or any other employer.
This week, we welcome podcaster and recovering FBI agent Kyle Seraphin. Thank you so much for coming on with me today. So how did you even come to enter the FBI?
It was kind of an accident. Actually, it was a real accident. So here's the goof part, right? So I started off my career in sales, which is how I look at the world. In a lot of ways, we're always doing sales. I think we're always negotiating with people. I have this thing. Are you willing to do it? And I look at sales not as a con job because I don't like people being con artists. My question was always, does the thing I have meet the need that you have and the amount of money that you're willing to pay for it? So I always looked at the world in these sort of like fair and mutual transactions, the way that we're told the market works. I worked for an ergonomic sales manufacturer. I worked for the radio station that my dad used to run when I was born as a salesperson. I went to Dell Incorporated, the computer company, and I sold like $20 million worth of business-to-business stuff. So I'm doing this thing, and then I had a terrible relationship with a bad girlfriend, and I ended up just leaving and going up to Kansas City, and I ran a restaurant for a little while, and that was kind of weird. And then I was homeless in San Diego, trying to figure out what I was doing with my life. And that's literally where I end up working for Warner Brothers. Right after that, I worked for a movie studio. I go up and do financial analysis. So this is the most unlikely path in the world. And while I'm at the movie studio, I'm like, I'm not creating anything. I'm not destroying anything. I'm 26 years old. I have no purpose and I need a purpose. And so I ended up enlisting in the military, and I took about an $80,000 pay cut to go be an enlisted guy in the military to do special operations. And that was the way that I launched towards the FBI, because that was like, how do I serve? Because I'm not doing anything for myself or for my country or for my, for a future family that I didn't have at the time. And the minute that I enlisted, maybe 2 months later, I met who is now my wife in October of 2009. And so I joined the military in June. I went through a basic training. I went through a selection. I meet my then, eventually wife. And that kind of put me on this path. In the military, I trained to be an air traffic controller and to be a combat diver. And I went through airborne school and all this other kind of stuff. I ended up being a paramedic. And when I got out, I applied to the FBI, immediately forgot about it because they never called me back. And I started working for this hospital, and I thought I was going to go be either a doctor or a physician's assistant. So I'm taking grad school courses or pre-grad school courses. I'm taking the GRE. I'm getting ready to put in applications to go to the thing. And then finally, the FBI randomly calls me up right when my wife and I gave up on being part of society. We were just like, we're going to go to Vermont. We're going to buy a house and turn it into a bed and breakfast, and we're going to just be innkeepers. That was our plan in 2015. So we went to Vermont, and we got to the town that my wife had been like, what I would call map recon. She's like doing Google Earth, right? And she's checking it out, and she's like flying through the town. And she's like, oh, this is amazing. And we got there, and within like 20 minutes of being in the town, she was like, I hate this place. We'll never live here. She's like, this looks like she's like, this is where axe murderers are from. And we ended up we sat in a hotel that was terrible. And we're in the hotel. And she was like, did you bring a gun with you? And I'm like, yeah, of course. And she was like, what is going on outside? And we look outside, there's like 2 hookers sitting in like folding chairs, and they're waiting for Johns, and there's bugs in the room.
Wait. This is Vermont?
This is in Vermont. Yeah, Brattleboro, Vermont. It's the Colonial Inn and Spa, if anyone's looking for a not good recommendation on where to stay. It's the only motel and spa I've ever heard of. The restaurant was closed. The spa was closed. It was terrible. So we're there for like, I had a job interview because we had a whole plan lined up, right? So I had a job interview with the rescue squad because I was a diver and a medic, and they needed somebody that had swiftwater experience, and I was all those things. And it was an okay paycheck. And so I was going to have pay. We could afford to buy a house, and we had a rental income because we'd rented out our apartment. We packed everything up and left. And so we had this whole scheme. And right when we get up there, my wife's like, nope, this place is terrible. I felt this vibe where I think a lot of American cities actually have this now, where they're feeling like they're dependent on other people's money and they resent those people, whether it be federal government money, whether it be like tourists, but they're not able to stand on their own 2 feet, which is that kind of American instinct. Like we have industry, we have worth. And so they didn't have that. And in Brattleboro, it's like 100% tourist industry and some skiing and some people that come in and do the bed and breakfast game. And it was like, they hated people and they hated us. And I knew it. And I was like, I don't want to live here. And she didn't want to live there. FBI calls us. God has a plan. I never know what that plan is going to be. And so they give me an interview. And the funniest thing, if I can say it's kind of funny, I would have probably not gotten that phone call if I was still living in Texas, because Texas has a lot of veterans and has a lot of people on the disabled veteran, roster that they have to prioritize. But I moved my application up to Connecticut, which is where my in-laws live. And so the FBI called me out of the Connecticut New Haven field office, a call I probably would have never gotten if I was in Texas. And then they had me eventually go and interview. And after the 18-month-long or 2-year interview process and the background checks and all this other stuff, I ended up getting hired in, and we start working for the FBI in Washington, D.C. It's a totally illogical journey, inclling a move back to Texas at that time. Because while we were waiting for the FBI to take us on, well, they were waiting to hire me, and they're like, "Oh, we'll hire you at some point in time. So you're conditional approval for hire, but we'll tell you in like 6 months or a year when to report. So go just live your life." And you're like, how do you live your life on hold? My wife took a job with Aetna, which was in Connecticut. And they were like, by the way, the job is in Austin, Texas, where you just left. So we ended up moving and renting a house in the town that we already owned a home in, and we're renting to somebody else. It's totally illogical. It's perfect for my story, though.
It is perfect. So what was your job within the FBI?
So I was a special agent. I was hired on to be what they call an 1811 criminal investigator, which is a broad federal term. Anybody who's familiar with criminal investigators, there's no such thing as a special agent. That's actually sort of a designation of what your job means. You're a limited authority of the federal government to operate as an agent only in these narrow parameters. But the job is criminal investigator, which is going to be a little bit more relevant when I tell you what they assigned me to, because I went through Quantico like everybody. It's a 21-week course. I get to the Washington field office, and I'm assigned to a counterintelligence squad, which could be hunting spies and traitors and people that are betraying the U.S. government in espionage or counterproliferation or selling our technology. That could be what they do, which are criminal violations. But that's not what I got to do. I got assigned to what is known as a non-establishment, non-CONUS counterintelligence squad. So we didn't have the embassy, which is one of the things you might look at for spies and people that are trying to convert Americans. We didn't have any of the military attaché parts. I was working on the Chinese government case, so that was what we did. And we didn't have violations of espionage or counterproliferation or technologies or anything criminal. We only were interested in non-US based Chinese intelligence officers that were recruiting people basically on the internet or in third-party countries that would never come to the US, that would never result in criminal charges. And the second we found something that looked like criminality, we had to hand it to another squad. So I'm not doing criminal investigations, and that's probably why I don't work for the FBI, because my first taste was like, this is pretty bittersweet. It also looks like constitutional violations left and right. My whistleblower activity started in 2017.
Now, what are the parameters of the reach of the FBI? Because the FBI shouldn't be looking at international anything, correct?
Yes and no. I guess if the threat originates overseas, there are parts of the FBI that does. Look, it's partly because the FBI's mission has creeped so dramatically, and we could probably trace that. And if people haven't heard it, they should. But 9/11 was a fundamental change. So we're now one day after the 23rd anniversary of that, right? We're talking about something that fundamentally changed the way Americans, particularly in my generation, looked at government service and why. I mean, I enlisted in the military at 2009, time of war. So I knew that that's what I was planning on doing. I was planning on going overseas and fighting. And the FBI got this sort of mandate that happened. And I've talked to guys in the national security space that said essentially before 9/11, there was one mission for national security. And it meant securing the American Republic and making sure the Constitution was our fundamental rule of law. And people die in that mission all the time. And people have, and I know people, and you may know people as well, and the listeners will as well. It's like people die defending the Constitution. That's what they signed up for. After 9/11, the internal part, the civilian service of the federal government that was involved in the counterterrorism apparatus got a different mandate. And that is that no American will die from terrorism on U.S. soil. And that's a fundamentally tyrannical thing. I think it's how we ended up getting to the COVID tyranny. It's how we got through the Patriot Act and a lot of the abuses thereof. And so the FBI's mission dramatically changed because it always had this sort of spy catching mission. If you were infiltrating the United States, then they were trying to catch you. And they've been doing that since like the 19 teens. They were going after communists. They were going after socialists. They were going after people in the civil rights movement. Like the FBI's got a lot of sins. And most of them involved overreaches of the Constitution. But this mission of trying to stop foreign influence in the United States, it used to be a kinetic mission. It's like, okay, they're gathering our documents. They're trying to steal programs for our super carriers. They're trying to get this technology. They're trying to convert a politician and get compromising information, whatever. At some point, they stopped doing that and they went into this information-only movement. And that's when the FBI became an intelligence agency. And I think the real shift happens after 9/11, where you get this mission set. By the time I get there in 2016, it's at least 60-40 intelligence to criminality, and maybe worse. And all the people that were getting promoted that I saw in the senior positions all came out of the national security side, which meant all of them had been doing things that were not, strictly speaking, a constitutional understanding of what law enforcement looks like. They believe they can have access to your information because they want information. They need information to be able to do their job. And so they're more than happy to go through processes that have nothing to do with due process. And that's what blew my mind. We had FISAs on foreign, individuals, mostly related to the intelligence community. This tenant media thing that we've been seeing that's been going on in the news, all this stuff screams FISA 702. And the Republicans funded it, which is kind of what we were talking about earlier. It's just like they keep funding this stuff, even though there's overwhelming evidence that it's being used to what's called reverse target, go after American citizens. It's being used to break the federal law that says you can't do it because it's a tool that's only used for something that is essentially unconstitutional. It's only really used to find Americans who are violating the law, because my job was criminal investigator. And I don't care about foreign spies that I'm never going to be able to arrest. I don't write indictments about that. What I want to find is, do you work for the US government? Are you part of the United States State Department? Are you working in a congressional office? And are you giving classified or otherwise sensitive information to the Chinese, to the Russians, to the Iranians, to whatever? That's what I want to do. That's my job. So when you give me a tool that lets me do that, and I can look into people's email boxes, I'm less interested in the Chinese spy that wants to talk to you and more interested in what you've been sharing with other people. And what else do you do? And who else do you know? And what do you talk to? And FISA and FISA 702 allow those investigations in a non-criminal way. So I didn't do this I didn't do this personally, but I saw it happening every single day because that's how you're incentivized to run the cases. It makes no sense.
And when were they put into policy?
So this was some kind of a change. Here, let me trace the kind of the counterterrorism mission, because I think that's where it crept into the national security. When that 9/11 switchover happened, essentially there was international terrorism. We were all aware of it. Anybody who lived through 9/11 saw it. And so you go, there are people overseas that hate America and they want to bring that problem here. And the FBI, like everybody else, wanted to prevent that. So they went out there and they're looking for international terrorists, right? And they're using all the tools they have. During that time, the tool of FISA, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which is around since the 70s. By the way, we made it through the entire Cold War, basically, without FISA, and then they created it because they needed this surveillance tool, which is real sketchy. And when you start realizing the timeline, you're like, wait a minute. We made it through all of that time without it. It's like 1974 is when I want to, in my memory, it may be a little bit off. But by the time the Cold War is basically at the tail end of it, they create this tool. After 9/11, they allow not just foreign intelligence, but also counterterrorism targets. So that's international terrorism organizations, Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, ISIS, whatever. And they looked for IT, international terrorism, inside the United States. And there's not a ton of it. It's like people that came in from overseas and are coming here to set up a terrorist base. It turns out there's not a lot of it. And they were also fighting our US military overseas, and the military did a great job. So then what do? You're a team that has a mission. You have a budget. You know how federal budgets work. You got to justify the budget. You got to fill the mission somehow. They started finding this thing they called HVEs. And HVEs are homegrown violent extremists. That is, lives here. Maybe you're a first generation. Maybe you're a new immigrant. Maybe you're a second or third generation Somali. Maybe you're from Iran. And you have some sympathies back with some foreign ideology. You're like, oh, they shouldn't have killed Soleimani. Whatever it is. You start aligning yourself with a foreign ideology. So you're homegrown violent extremists. You're now a domestic problem with a foreign ideology. And as long as we can trace you to that, we can use FISA as well. So they started doing that. Turns out you run out of those people pretty quick too, because there's not a lot of people that live in America and go, this is terrible. I'd rather go live in the sand somewhere. It's just not a thing. So then they started doing this look internally. And that's where it got really sketchy, because they started looking for what they call violent extremists, domestic violent extremists. That's your militia violent extremists, like my Betsy
it's
Ross
all
flag.
based on their definition, which we're definitely seeing right now.
It's not based on a crime. It's based on a threat. And that is a really, really scary thing. There's no constitutional definition of a threat. There's very little legal definition of what a threat is when it comes to federal criminal law. So we're talking about things for the sake of information. That's how you go after the Chinese threat, the Iranian threat, the Israeli threat. Take your pick. When you start talking about threats, it's about how I describe an ideology, and I don't have to prove a criminal case. So a huge chunk of the FBI's work now is not about criminality. It's about information. And that is a secret police force. That's the argument I would make.
Yes. So I was actually just listening to, was it Sharona Bishop's story? She was a mom that showed up at one of the Colorado school board meetings, and she was talking about, I'm pretty sure about the lockdowns, of COVID policies, all COVID narratives. And a little while later, the FBI agent swarmed her house. I mean, intimidated her. Her husband was law enforcement, and he was there. He got out the Constitution right there with the FBI agent, swarming with the kids right there. And he was saying, this is what the Constitution says. This is how you're violating it. But they kept asking, the parents kept asking, what have we done wrong? Which tell us, what do you have on us? And eventually one of the FBI agents said, you connect people.
That's a threat. That's the threat landscape.
Information threat. Yeah. So when were you given cause to question the behavior of the FBI?
Almost immediately. So I had cases. So I'll be real specific.
Immediately?
Like the first couple of days that I was in the FBI's offices in Washington, D.C. So that would have been like December of 2016. I'd been an FBI agent for 15 minutes after they gave me my badge and my gun in November. My first report in, they assigned me 8 cases. And of those 8 cases, all of them were crap. They were all terrible. They were non-criminal violations. As I described, that's what our work was. But they were also open for the sake of being open on American citizens without any justification or even an inclination that they had done something wrong. The predication is what we call it when you open a case on them was so light and thin that when I read the case, I did what you're supposed to do. You show up as a new agent. I'm 36 years old at that point in time. I'm a grown man who's like surrounded by a bunch of new agents who are 25 and just got into the federal government with their first job. They're really excited. I've had a bunch of jobs. I got there, and one of the first things I told my parents and I told my wife, because we didn't have any kids at the time, I was like, I don't know if I'm going to do 20 years of this job. I'd like to be able to think that I could do that, but I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to do that. I'm not even sure I'm going to get off probation. And I had a 1-year probation period, which was almost over. It was 5 more months left. So I get in there, and I have a temporary supervisor who's a wonderful human being. She was a real sweetheart. She was an acting supervisor. And then my real supervisor came in and was the worst boss that I've ever had in my entire life, including when I was a 16-year-old working at Baskin Robbins. The dumbest, least scrupulous human being. She is now in charge. She's a section chief in charge of the domestic terrorism mission. She runs the explosive research center for the FBI down at Redstone Arsenal. And I'm fairly confident she's never seen a bomb in the wild, and she's never used explosives. And I've had people question. It's like, yeah, I've got 100 hours of demo training. What do you have? I'm not an expert, but I know more than you do. Like most FBI agents have never touched C4 or dynamite or anything like that. I've touched all that. And I've used them all and done demo. So I'm in this office. They assigned me these 8 cases, and they're all garbage. It's like this guy had very vague information on his SF-86. So people who are federal employees know if you have a background check, you fill out the standard form 86. It's all the places you've lived. It's somebody who knew you there. It's your background references. It's your mom. It's your high school teacher. It's all this stuff. It's your drill sergeant, it's your captain when you were in the military, blah, blah, blah. So he didn't fill his out like he cared about it. He was a GS-15 direct hired into like a semi-political appointee job. And he probably knows that I'm talking about him at this point because I've kind of given enough about it, not on purpose. Like nobody else would know who he is. But I went into his office. I read the whole file and I'm like, this is garbage. There's no reason to be investigating this man. He had a chance encounter that he worked and it was in the same grad school program as a known Chinese intelligence officer back when he was in undergrad and his grad school time. And they had been in the same program in San Diego. And then he spent 7 years in the U.S. Federal Service. He had like GS-14, GS-15 time. No indication he'd ever done anything wrong. No indication that he had any real connection to this guy, and some minor connections on public Facebook interactions where the guy said something and he said something innocuous. And so finally, I'm like, hey, can I go interview this guy and just shut this case down? And they said no, because then you won't have something for your file review. The reason these cases were open was because of a file review, which is an administrative requirement that I had cases that I was working on. They didn't have enough work for me, and it was obvious. And so I was like, finally, I get the ability to go and sit down with this guy. And he said exactly what I thought he would say, because I knew. I told the other agent who was with me, who was like a senior agent, even though he was younger than me. I go, this guy's going to tell you that he's lazy. He's going to tell you, I didn't care about filling out my form, because I know that because I read his form, and he's like a surfer bro from San Diego. Like, he didn't care. It was clearly obvious. You know how you filled out the background check form? Yes? You've done one of these?
I have.
You've seen it done?
Yes.
All right. Imagine if somebody said, you lived, put down a place you lived, and you say, I used to live in Dallas, Texas. And they would say, give me 3 names of people who knew you in Dallas, Texas. And so you would name an ex-boyfriend, and you would name like an employer, and you would name a personal friend. And underneath the ex-girlfriend, which is one of the things that was a reference, the question was, where does she live? Like, what was your relationship? Ex-girlfriend. Where does she live? Dallas, Texas. No phone number, no email address, no nothing. Like, just didn't care. Got the job anyway. That was really obvious to me that this guy did not care about filling out this form. And so when I sat down with him, I said, I'm here to talk to you about something. It was a pretense, because the real story was about the Chinese intelligence officer interactions. But I'm sitting here talking to him, and I just go, I'm here to talk because you didn't list any foreign contacts, and you worked overseas for 6 years for the Treasury. And he was like, to be honest with you, I just didn't really care about that form. And I was like, I know. So we closed it.
The FBI is looking for information to connect people to different investigations that they have open. But obviously these policies have gotten to the point where they're calling homeschooling moms who are showing up at board meetings like domestic terrorists. So how do we stop that? Go ahead.
Well, you have to defund the intelligence mission, but people have to understand what these things are. So let me give it to them in like an easy way to grasp it. Criminal investigations, what people think the FBI does, are linear. A crime happens. It's a federal crime. That's the first bar. We have to actually say that there's a federal nexus. So some federal law, Title 18 or Title 21, has been broken, and that we can actually assign that, and that it actually meets the threshold that the United States Attorney's Office cares about. Because there's lots of federal crimes that happen all the time, and they don't care. Declined prosecution is very common. So we have to have a linear thing. Something happened. Then we're going to go find out who did that thing. Then we're going to go gather evidence that they did, that we can prove it in a court of law. And then they're either going to plea out or go to trial. And the trial either has a guilty or a not guilty verdict. And then there's appeals, but that's it. It ends with someone in prison or not in prison, usually in prison. Because when you do a federal investigation that the AUSA, the Assistant United States Attorney, takes, they get found guilty because they only take the cases they're going to win. So there you go. That's criminal. That's what people think the FBI does. And what they do more often than not, probably 60%, maybe 65%, are intelligence investigations. And they're a circle. And what they do is they start with a person. I have this person, and they did this thing. They're connected to some other circle that I had running. Usually the circles predate you as an investigator. So that touches another circle. Hey, I'm dealing with something with Russia. This person also talked to somebody in China. You're a China guy. Take the China case. I start investigating them. I find out who they are. I find out who they talk to. I find out what their bank records look like. I'm not telling any of them this. There's no allegation they've done anything wrong. These are intelligence investigations for the purpose of information. Then I find out who they're emailing. Then we find out that they're emailing these people. Those people are interesting too. So we spin off another circle. And now we create this whole web like a vortex of whirlpools that are only for information with no allegation of wrongdoing. And one of them just happens to be a political priority of the current administration, which is that parents are not supposed to say no when they want to teach transgender ideology, when they want to teach things that are about vaccines or religious sort of beliefs that have no business being in our public schools. And if you go out there and protest that, because the National Administration of School Boards, right, the school board administration came forward and told the administration, hey, these people are terrorists. They're making us feel unsafe. That's when they decided to go after them.
Is it really left up to the whim of the current administration? Because I cannot believe that this stuff was not happening wildly under Republicans. I mean,
it's been growing.
I can tell.
There's no doubt.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, it didn't hatch fully formed like Athena out of the head of Zeus or anything. This stuff has been kind of growing. So the way that it's happened is, first of all, we have to remember that the administrative state continues to grow, and that of the last 16 years, 12 of it has been under Democrats. So 16 years is basically enough to take somebody from inception to full-fledged SES in most of the federal services. So we have what I call ideological capture. There's probably other names for it, but that's what the administrative or the deep state looks like. And we've all dealt with it if you work in the federal government. It doesn't matter what department you're in. These are people. They're the worst people. They're the worst managers. They're the worst human beings oftentimes that volunteer to be in charge. and they should be in charge of no one. So rather than reluctant and capable leadership, we get the one person that raises their hand with the minimum amount of time of experience in a managerial role. And those people, they're threatened by real capable people as well. So they hire more of their garbage type. And when at some point in time, you end up with an entire DOJ where the upper echelon are full of untalented, uncoordinated, and basically unhireable in any other field. They are ideologically driven, and they don't need to be told what to do because they're already pushing their own agenda. And it doesn't matter if Donald Trump is in charge or if Barack Obama or if Joe Biden's in charge. They're running their show, which is why the attorney general is sort of irrelevant. The FBI director even goes on record regularly and saying, I have oversight of the FBI, but he doesn't run the FBI. Anybody who knows about this knows that the deputy director runs the FBI because he's an FBI agent that worked his way up. And by the way, the current FBI agent, deputy director, that's Paul Abate. And he's known right now for massive rumors that he's been impregnating employees. And he generally speaks with black females. So he's sleeping with people that work in the office, and he's 100% BLM sympathetic. So why are we seeing bad policies in Portland, Washington, D.C., Minneapolis, Chicago? It's because the people that are whispering in the pillow talk of the guy who runs the actual agency, they're totally inclined to go along with it. That's who he's surrounding himself with.
How much do you think the FBI is colluding with the media on this as well?
A bunch. We're seeing that. That's what the Twitter files were all about. So the FBI actually thinks that they should be able to issue a statement and that the media will not question it. And we've seen that in some of the things that my reporting, which I'm not a reporter, but I happen to report some things because I got a social media following. When I put something out, the FBI says they didn't like it and they expect their entire statement to be run. And when someone from Fox News or Daily Wire or Just the News with John Solomon, and when they run my story and they don't perfectly quote the entirety of the DOJ statement or FBI statement, the DOJ calls back and complains, because I hear this on the back end of it. They're like, the DOJ actually called us and said they were pissed that we didn't run their entire statement in its entirety verbatim. And it's like, well, that's not your job. Like, you can print anything you want. Freedom of the press. We also know that they've been trying to censor thousands, if not tens of thousands of Americans for what they call mis, dis, and malinformation. My favorite is malinformation. That's what I love, because malinformation is stuff that's true. It's just inconvenient to the regime. And they've actually labeled that as an actual threat. So how crazy are you when the thing that you're saying is factually accurate, but it's not comfortable for the power? Like, this is totally Orwellian, and not in an ironic or fun way. It's terrifying. And the FBI is embedded in this. That's what Bronze Griffin is, which we've been told it's a penetration of social media companies. We got to see Twitter, but they're in Google, they're in Yahoo, they're in Facebook, Meta, take your pick. They're also have been doing this since the 70s. They call it the Mockingbird Media because that was the operation that was being run by the intelligence services. To think that that has the same name is silly, but to think that that sort of operation is not standard, of course it's standard. We've seen it over and over again. Look at the people that are out there in Hollywood that have foundations that have 6 members, former CIA members on there. And I actually trust the CIA more than I trust the FBI, for whatever that's worth, because I know better people in the CIA than the FBI.
Yeah, we had Garrett Boyle on a bit ago, and he said, I have no hope for the FBI. What do you think? Scrap
it. Salt the earth, burn the buildings down. I'm telling you, here's the thing, and this is the way I look at it. You can't tarnish your brand the way that it has. And the FBI's had sins in every single decade. There's no doubt about it. We should have a unified group of people in America that said civil liberties are important. Everybody's civil liberties are important. And if they're going after my political opponents, they may turn on me. Do you know how you have evidence of that? They tried to get Martin Luther King Jr. to kill himself, right? They started this immediately in 1919 with the Palmer raids, going after communists. Now, maybe there was a good reason, but it's not constitutional. So maybe you're American, you're like, well, I don't really like communists. How long is it going to be before they come after grandmothers or women that are standing at school board meetings? And of course, that's the reason why my whistleblowing activity got public, is I was one of 2 people who got an email saying 5 days after Merrick Garland said, we're not going to use those counterterrorism resources on parents at school board meetings, I get an email from the assistant director of counterterrorism at the FBI saying, here's a new threat tag. Again, that word threat. This is a tag of information, kind of like a hashtag, so you can find it easily. And they're going to threat tag parents under this thing called EDU officials, which was a CT and a criminal designation. If they could find criminal charges, they would. Otherwise, they'd open up a CT case, which is non-criminal.
What's a CT case again?
Counterterrorism. So the biggest kind of like factions of the FBI kind of break down like this. It's criminal and national security. And national security has counterterrorism, and they also have counterintelligence. So those are your national security violations. And they're really the thing that are the problem. Like, the FBI can't have that. Now, I'm also a realist. They're not going to scrap the FBI because we've already seen that they're not going to do it. They're going to fund a new headquarters, and we're going to be, we're going to be suffering under this tyranny. But we should be pushing as hard as possible that they reform this animal, because I don't know if you can push it back in the cage, but we should cut off the claws and put it back in the cage, because that's a real scary thing.
So how do you bring accountability and reform to the FBI? If it still will be around, how do you actually do it?
Well, there's Kyle Seraphin's version of it. Like I said, these are all incremental steps. I would get rid of it entirely. Position 1. Position 2, slightly softer, is anybody that holds a GS-14 or higher position should be eliminated. I don't think you can be a manager that's worked in the FBI, that has seen what you've seen. If you haven't come forward as a whistleblower and there's no documentation of you bringing this stuff to Congress or within your chain of command, you're done for me. You violated your oath. So how do you do that? And then I would also like to see all the other people that did things that were unconstitutional, that were illegal or immoral. And I'd like to have them interviewed for their jobs. And the answer should be very straightforward. Did you know what you did was wrong, that it was a violation of the Fourth Amendment or the First Amendment? Did you know that? The Second Amendment? Were you out there violating the Constitution knowingly? And if so, you're gone. And if no, let's re-educate you and put you back through a constitutional law class so you understand why we founded this republic and how. And you can never hold a managerial position because you've been found unworthy. If we want to do that, that'd be great. And then as far as the national security mission goes, give it to somebody else, someone who doesn't have a badge and a gun. The scary thing about having that intel mission, being able to do what are called national security letters, which are these subpoenas that don't answer to anybody except the FBI. There are, FISA tools where we can actually go get these wiretaps, but nobody's going to ever know about it, and they're never going to be revealed. And the reasons for them are going to be considered classified, either at secret or top secret levels. The reason you can't do that is because once I know where something is, I know about a violation of federal law, I can go build that any way I want. On the other side, it's called parallel construction. So I have a national security case where I incidentally find out that you're money laundering, even though I was just looking at you to find out whether you were sending night vision goggles to Iran. I found out that you're doing money laundering because now I've looked at your bank records. Now I can go out there and get a source, someone near you, and I can ask them. It's like, look, I know Stephanie's doing money laundering. I know that she's taking money in and putting it here. I need you to tell me that that's true too, because I know you know. Otherwise, you're going to be in violation of 18 U.S.C. 1001. And that person says, yeah, she is. I go, great. Now my case is predicated on the criminal side by a source and not by FISA and not by an NSL, not by a national security tool. So a source predicated it. Now I can go out there and get a subpoena, or I can go out there and get a search warrant and get your bank records, and I will. And it's going to prove the thing that I sue. I already knew it was there. I'm not going to make the judge look bad no matter how thin it is, because I already have the real evidence from FISA. And so when I build that criminal case, it's going to stick. And then you're going to go to jail, or you're going to plea out, and you're going to lose your gun rights and all the other things. So you can't have the access to national security tools and do law enforcement in a constitutional manner. That's called a secret police. And they've done it in every major tyrannical regime for the last 150 years. Nobody wants to have a secret police. That's what the FBI functions like right now. And it doesn't mean that people that work there are bad people. They're using the system they have. They're following orders when they should be asking questions. And that's why I don't work there anymore.
How many whistleblowers have come forward?
Hard to say. I know that there's been probably a couple dozen tops. The numbers that I have, like that are 100% that I can verify, are under a dozen. But Jim Jordan's office said that there were several dozen. So I'll take him at his word. I don't take him at his word a lot, but
what are the specific things that you went to Congress, correct?
Well, I started off, my first whistleblowing activity was going through my chain of command. So just like in the military and just like any other civilian service in the government, there is a prescribed way to be a whistleblower. The FBI is a little bit more narrow in how you do it, but you can go to your chain of command and say, I think that this is a violation of rule, policy, law. I think this is fraud, waste, and abuse. I think this represents a gross danger to the public. Those are the kind of the criteria that you have to meet. Yes. So you could tell I said it fast enough because I've said this a lot and I think about it a lot. The second thing is you can go to the outside agencies, the watchdog group. This is the Office of the Inspector General. You can go find any other watchdog group, or even your internal affairs, the Office of Professional Responsibility at your agency or at the governing department, and you can bring it to them and say, this is a problem, which I did that too. I've done all these things, by the way. I brought stuff up almost immediately to my bosses, and I said, I don't think what we're doing is legal. And they said, well, you should just shut up and color, essentially. And then they asked me eventually, like, what do you want to do here? And I said, I want to not be on the squad doing this work anymore, or I'm going to resign from the FBI. That was less than 18 months into my job.
And so this was 2017?
17 and then 18. Okay. My boss and I had a discussion in 2018, and then January. And she said, where do you see yourself in 5 years in this agency? I said, if I'm on the squad in 6 months, I'm going to be resigning. So I don't really have a 5-year plan. I've got about a 5-month plan, and it better be finding me somewhere where I'm not doing this work anymore. And she was like, ugh. And to the credit of the people that I brought some of the whistleblowing activity, I actually showed that my boss was violating federal employment law, which is pretty funny. And they said, we're not going to prosecute that.
And she's still on the team?
Of course. Yeah, for sure.
She probably promoted.
She's been promoted several times. Yeah, she was the assistant special agent in charge of the Minneapolis field office while they were having the George Floyd riots, of all things. She was in charge of the criminal division out there, and she blew it. And so she got, it's the Peter principle, the F up, move up kind of thing that we see in government all the time. So she's in charge of, she might even be more than a section chief now. I guarantee she's on her way to take over a field office, and she's an atrocious person. And she's also like, she was bizarre. Like, she did things that you would know are sexually inappropriate in a workplace. Like, she put her hand on my shoulder and kind of massaged my arm and said, this is a really nice looking shirt on you. And I was like, don't ever do that again. My wife's from Brooklyn. She'll stab you. Like, don't, I have to burn this shirt now. I'm never going to wear it again. Like, you can't do that as a man. I couldn't walk up to you and put my hand on you and say, it's a lovely blouse. You should wear it more frequently. I'd be out of a job immediately, and there would be a settlement, right? So she did stuff like that on a regular basis. So she'd go, oh, you shouldn't have a beard. And I said, well, I have a sincerely held belief that says I need to have a beard. And she was like, oh, you're so silly. And I'm like, do you need me to go swear that out in front of the HR people? Because I'll give you an affidavit. You don't get to decide what my Title VII sincerely held beliefs are. Do you not understand employment law as it's been written? It's very easy. This is basic managerial stuff. And also, the FBI doesn't have a dress code, by the way, or an appearance code. So none of those things were relevant to my employment, but she would do it regularly. So that lady's been promoted. And then in the meantime, it's like the decent people, the whistleblowers that came forward and said, hey, this is a problem. And I've been to OIG and I've been to OPR and I went to my internal management structure. Eventually, in 2021, I get this email in October of 2021, and it says that we're going to be doing this thing that the Attorney General explicitly said we weren't going to do. And I brought it to a member of Congress in New Mexico, and it made it to Jim Jordan's office. And then, and I know this for, we won't call it fact, we'll call this strong evidence, and I'm sure it could be proved factually. One of the attorneys that works in the FBI called me up and said, I had a guy from your office, the lead attorney in your office, called Washington, D.C. asking about you and said, I've got a guy that's refusing the COVID shot, and he's also a whistleblower. What should we do with him? And his statement back was, you should promote him, which is funny. Of course, neither of us work for the FBI right now. We both got walked out. Both of us. He's one of the whistleblowers that was involved. He got walked out because he also helped me reveal that the FBI was targeting Catholics, which is a First Amendment violation.
Yeah. So how did you see that?
Yeah. So the first thing is I get an email randomly. I'm walking down the hallway in this little office in Las Cruces, New Mexico, which is underneath the Albuquerque field office. And we have maybe 16 or 20 total employees. And I've got a administrative, like a intel analyst that's standing in the hallway talking to some other guy. I can't remember who was in the hallway. And he said, hey, did you see that email? And I said, I don't know what you're talking about, so probably not. And he said, we just got an email from FBI, from Hoover, that said that we're going to be creating a threat tag for parents. And I was like, what? And he goes, dude, I'll send it to you. It was only sent out to the heads of the field offices. And then the head of my field office sent it down to his ASACs, the GS-15. So SES to 15. The 15 ended up sending it out to all the 14s, including the intel analyst. So not my boss, but one of the other people that was a supervisor sent it over to me as kind of a like, isn't this crazy? And I looked at it and I printed it out, and I already had a meeting set up with my member of Congress to go talk about the violations that I saw of Afghans coming in by the 100,000 to this country, because this was right after the withdrawal in August and September. This is early October. I'm going into the office to tell them that, look, there's some wild stuff happening on these military bases at Fort Bliss and at Holloman Air Force Base. We've got 10,000 Afghan parolees on both of those locations. We had 20,000 of the 100,000 Afghans in an AOR that had 6 FBI agents, and we were responsible for investigating all violent crime. And there was violent crime every day. There was sexual assault, there were beatings, there were just fights and stuff like that. And that was all our territory, because Air Force OSI did not have that authority necessarily. They were part of it, but they didn't. The major crimes had to come to us. So I'm out there doing interviews with people that are claimed to be sexual assaulted, women that were being grabbed by the hair and told that now you're my wife, because nobody told these people about the rules in America. And at the same time, I get this email, another kind of version of like, I'm fairly confident God's got a plan. I already had the appointment. So it's like 3 days after I get this email, I'm in there telling the community relations and their law enforcement liaison, this is what I got. And they took 4 pages of handwritten notes. That was my first whistleblower disclosure to Congress. And it also turned out to be one of the last things I did as an FBI agent, because I got kicked out of the office just a couple weeks later because I refused to put a COVID stick up my nose every 72 hours, which also is crazy. Like,
yeah.
So I went.
So
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well,
No, you go ahead.
The fact of the matter was, I was a paramedic for over a decade, and I had a top secret clearance. And I've done thousands of nasal swabs in an emergency clinical setting. So I'm a pretty good expert on whether or not I need to take a COVID test. And I said, I'm not going to test without symptoms. The end.
Mm-hmm.
It's discriminatory. And the sad thing is this goes back to your question about the supervisors. My boss said, I understand what you're saying, and I believe you, and I side with you. But I have a mortgage payment, and I have alimony to my ex-wife. And so I can't stand with you. You're on your own. And I lost my job and my paycheck for 4 months or 3.5 months because my boss said, what you're doing is right, but I'm not willing to stand with you on it. And that's the reason why the FBI should be destroyed, because he's a good man and he was a good supervisor. He was the best boss I had in the entire FBI the whole time I was there. And that was his statement. So how sad.
That's pretty much every federal employee in every agency, though.
That's right. All of them. They all showed cowardice when they should have shown strength. They all showed institutional loyalty instead of constitutional loyalty. And that's the difference between the people that don't work there anymore and that have been kicked out. Particularly the FBI was egregious. The Feds for Medical Freedom and the now Feds for Freedom kind of group put together these lawsuits. And when you talk to the attorneys, they're like, the most egregious violators were the FBI. They went over and above because they needed the foot soldiers, the people with the badges and the guns, the people that are going to do the knocking on doors and violate the Constitution. They needed those people in line because that's the big stick. And if you get them in line, then how are you going to find somebody from Commerce to stand up when they know that the FBI is around the corner and has been knocking on doors? You need the FBI to be 100% in lockstep. There's a reason why me and the guys that went to Jim Jordan's office call it a compliance purge. There were 2 opportunities for compliance. One of them was get the shot and shut your mouth and don't worry about it. And the answer for me was like, no, I'm a pro-life Christian. And I don't like the way it was designed. So that's a no-go for me. Now, what do you want to do? And they gave a second opportunity. Drop a knee and show fealty to this administration by putting something illogical up your nose every 72 hours. Do this menial, stupid compliance exercise. And as somebody who has a background in emergency medicine and who understands how medical symptoms work, like I said, training to go into the medical field. I thought I've taken more biology than Lisa Monaco or Lee Loftus or any of the people that are the assistant attorney generals. I guarantee I know more about public health than they do. And I've done more nasal swabs than they have. And it's like, I'm not doing that. We've never done prophylactic testing for a disease on a 72-hour basis. You're more likely to get the disease while you're doing the test. And they changed the rules. And so we watched them change the rules in real time. So we knew they didn't have the courage of their convictions. They changed the religious input as far as what you could do to get an exemption. They changed the way that you had to do the testing. First, it had to be at a facility. Then it could be an at-home test, but it had to be watched by some kind of supervisor. It's probably a HIPAA violation. And then they had this other thing where you could do it yourself. And then it had to be uploaded, or then it had to be, at least that you swore that you did it, but it was going to be uploaded. And it's like, all of this is crap. And none of it is stopping the disease, which we all got on duty. I got it on duty. I got it from a dude on SWAT who showed up sick. And then I went home sick. And it's like, now I got it. And when I got it, my wife was pregnant and I had 2 little kids and there was no shots or vaccines or treatments and nobody knew what the heck to do. So it's like, you guys didn't care about me in 2020. I went to 20 different states while the country was locked down for counterterrorism investigations. And you're going to tell me suddenly I got to go do something for you? Not happening. So my compliance was none. I was radically uncompliant. And interestingly, in the Southern District of Texas, where our lawsuit goes on, I'm the only name that's on both the constructive discharge, which means they fired me unjustly, but they didn't call it firing, and the religious discrimination because I held my ground on it. So we're going to have some case law, hopefully, on this, which will be fun.
Yeah. So where are you with the lawsuits and complaints? And I know that our own Jim Erdman has been using your case and pointing to it as this is going to help us. So tell us, what do you think is going to come out of yours?
I'm very pragmatic about a lot of this stuff. I haven't seen a lot of justice in the world, and I've seen the DOJ find a way to run away and get moot decisions. So like the Fifth Circuit decision where we were obviously going to get favorable adjudication. And if the Supreme Court ruled on it, they would have ruled that the mandates were unconstitutional. The DOJ has run away from these and made them moot point, so they cannot continue. In the case of mine, we've passed the motion to dismiss, which is the big hurdle. So in my case, religious discrimination, both as a class and as an individual, and the constructive termination, which is to say they did everything but fire me. They basically said, you still work here, but we're not going to pay you. You can't come to work. If you do come to work, if you claim to be an employee, we're going to come after you legally. And by the way, we're investigating you for these felonies we just made up, because they came at me with some felony charges, which were pretty wild, based on nonsense, absolute nonsense, which is why they didn't pursue them. I'm also told they're trying to hit me for some obstruction of justice charges because of my whistleblowing activity. So the DOJ is concerned about what I'm about. I'm skeptical that it's going to result in anything big. So it's a long shot. But what it shows is that a federal judge, who, by the way, was nominated by a Democrat in Texas, who's like a reasonable old school liberal, looked at this on its face and went, you can't do that. The reason why people in the Bureau were kicked out at such a high rate is the Bureau found kind of a cheat code to go after and get rid of whistleblowers and get rid of people that didn't want the COVID vaccine. And they did it under this decision called Navy versus Egan. And so this has been the hide that they've been doing. They removed the underlying condition for employment, the security clearance. They never actually fired anybody. They just said, the thing you need to do your job no longer exists. It's like if you're a runner and they took your legs off, and then you'd be like, well, you're not much of a runner. You could still run if you can, but you have no legs. And you're like, okay, thank you. So they didn't pay us. You know, I went for 14 months without pay. My buddy Garrett O'Boyle's now at 24 months as of this month.
So what are you doing now?
I run a podcast. That's what I do.
You're doing a great job.
I literally run, I mean, you can see it behind me here. I do 2 podcasts now. I work with a group that does Catholic advocacy, because one of the things that happened during this time, and this is why I do think that faith is a big chunk of it, and why I think that maybe my family's faith is a big chunk of it, is my wife was born in Brooklyn, and she grew up to an atheist father and a non-practicing. My mother-in-law came out one time and told us she was Jewish out of nowhere, which was funny. I guess she converted to Judaism when she was trying to get married the first of 3 times. So that was kind of amusing to us. We're like, are you Jewish though? Like, I don't think you are. She didn't have a faith tradition. And I grew up in a Catholic family. I'm one of 6 kids. So I grew up in a pretty classic Catholic thing. I went to Catholic schools. I went to Jesuit high schools. So I was educated in the faith. And like a lot of people who were in their 20s and didn't have a lot of use for it because I didn't have kids, I kind of stopped going, and it just wasn't really relevant. America was good. The world was pretty clean and helpful and safe. And the times were not all that difficult where I had to turn to God. And as my wife and I moved to New Mexico, which we moved there because of the COVID crazy, we saw that happened in Virginia and DC. She started RCIA, the Rite of Christian Initiation for Adults. So she started converting to being a Catholic. And I think they would actually argue that when you start that, you become a Catholic. You're just not baptized. And she was baptized a week before, on Easter, a week before they took my badge and my gun. And so we were very hardened in a faith position that basically grew out of watching government tyranny and realizing that when things get harder in the world, people tend to turn to God. And then a lot of illogical things that you could not make an argument for happening by any probability. It's just totally unlikely. All these things kind of turned our way. And so some of the stuff that I do is kind of making an advocacy for traditional things that I grew up knowing, that people in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s in America believed without question at like a 90+% rating. The basic things of that there are good and evil. And
give us some examples of what you talk about.
Some of the example, like the things that you would never be able to expect. I'll give you some
examples of, sure.
Well, okay, things that everybody, boys are boys and girls are girls. That's pretty straightforward stuff. There was no, like, I remember watching Kindergarten Cop, and the funniest part of Kindergarten Cop is like a 5-year-old saying boys have a penis and girls have a vagina. And the guy's like, I know it, like, don't tell me that. You know, like he's trying to do kindergarten, and kindergarten teachers, that would have been frustrating because of course they know that. You know, my daddy's a gynecologist and this is what he does all day. That was the jokes from Kindergarten Cop. Nobody was going to argue that with you. That's absurd.
Of course not.
It's craziness that we would do that. Here's another funny thing. When I went to the FBI Academy in 2016, I thought they were ridiculous. They asked me on a questionnaire what my gender was. And they asked me whether I was homosexual and if I was transgender. And so I filled it out with...
What year was this?
2016. They already had all my medical records. I signed away all my medical records for the military and 35 years of life. So the FBI went to every hospital and picked them all up. That's part of how you get the clearance. They grabbed all my stuff, including a psych history. I had one meeting with one psychologist that my first sergeant recommended because I was really pissed off when I was leaving the Air Force. And so she called me up in 2015 and she said, there's some FBI agents here and they want to pick up your psychology records. And I was like, okay. Yeah. And she's like, they have a paper that you signed. And I'm like, I know. Yeah, give it to him. And she was like, are you sure? And I'm like, why? What did you write? All I did was come to tell you that I was mad, that I really didn't like how the military treated my, my enlistment. And she's like, okay. Like, obviously it wasn't that big a deal because I was hired on and I got the clearance. But they got all that. And then they sent out this ridiculous questionnaire while I'm at the academy as a student. Are you a male, a female, or I don't know if there was a third option in there, but at that point in time, it was male or female. And I was like, female, screw you. And they said, are you homosexual? And I wrote, decline to comment. And then it said, are you transgender? And I wrote, decline to comment, none of your business. These are radio button clicks. And then they asked me about my race. And it's like, I'm Native American, just like Elizabeth Warren. Like, there's a great story about my family being Native American because my grandmother had big feet and she was adopted outside of a reservation in Montana. She was dropped off with the nuns at a hospital from a mother that was hard to trace. So maybe we are. She lived right next to the Blackfoot Reservation, and that was always the family lore. So I clicked that too, because screw you, this is a dumb questionnaire. And nothing happened when I went and did my PT test. I was trained, I was tested as a male. And then in 2017, when I got to the field office, tested as a male. 2018, same thing. 2019, same thing. 2020, they had us test at home because people weren't going into the office for PT tests. And in 2020, they rated me against the female agents for my scores. And I was rated as a female agent for the first time in 2020. And the same thing in 2021. So I sit
Anyone
down.
looking at you could tell you're not a female, Kyle.
I got a beard. I had a much bigger beard when I was in the FBI. I was a high-ranked physical performance FBI female agent in 2020 and 2021. I was like in the top 10 for every category. I also weigh like 180 pounds at 5'8", so I'm not as fast as some of these skinny little ladies that were out there running. So my 2-mile run wasn't as good, but my sprint was like top-notch, top 3. And we had college, NCAA athlete female sprinters in the 30 to 39 category. By the way, I was 39 years old, crushing all the 30-year-old women, which is ridiculous, which is another thing that we all used to know. That a guy with a beard doesn't get to say that he's a woman. They took me seriously, so I took it seriously too. I said, I'm gender fluid, and when I'm at work, I consider myself a female. When I go home, I'm a dad. You can't say otherwise. My truth. And my boss goes, are you being serious right now? And I was like, yeah, 100%. Like I just looked him in the eye because I was. That's the truth. Say otherwise. These are some of the things that we used to actually know were real in this world.
I'm sorry.
I got you off guard.
It's really, really disturbing that they would actually go along with that. The
it's on my
FBI
SF-50.
would act. I'm sorry. It's not just, it's astounding. It's shocking.
I'm the first female FBI agent, transgender female to be removed from the FBI for whistleblowing. So what about that? Put the math down on this. I have government documentation showing that my gender, or they actually lifted as sex, is female for 2 years of promotions. And for my administrative cause of actions, they're all listed as female. And I'm not telling you that I wasn't, because at the time I could be whatever I wanted. And it sounds like it was probably true back then. That's why I wrote it down. I'm sure of it.
Kyle,
say otherwise.
Are your children like this as well? Do they argue with you? Now, I have 3 children that argue with me.
So I have one that gets very hurt if I correct her, and she withdraws. She's more like her mother, and she's lovely. I have one mini-me that gets very angry if she gets corrected. And my oldest, so I have 4 children. My oldest is 7 right now. And when we moved into this house, she was 5 years old. So are they like me? No. But do they know what's going on in the world at a level that I did not? Yes. Because when we moved into this house, another piece of faith stuff, my wife and I say grace over meals. We always say a blessing. Doesn't matter where we are. We do it in public. It's very awkward for her. It used to be. And now it's kind of like a badge of honor to be the only people that do that when you go to a restaurant, because the food's the same. We're still eating. And so we have this.
That's if you have money to go out.
Right. It's exactly true, which is very difficult for a lot of people right now.
Yes.
Especially depending on where you live. We live in a very small little town and things are pretty affordable here, luckily. Not groceries, but it's not tragic. And when we go out, I remember we were sitting at our kitchen table right when we moved in here. And we moved in here after having no income for a year. So this was in April of 2023. We get down there. We have one of our first meals in this new house that we've rented out because my wife was pregnant, by the way. We had no insurance, no job, no money. Income rather, not no money. And we're sitting here having this grace, and my daughter asked if she could say grace over the food. And she said, bless this Father, bless this family, bless this food, and keep us safe from our enemies. And she was 5. And my wife and I kind of have the wide eyes like you do when your spouse and you hear something from your kid and you're like, oh my goodness, like what are we telling our kids? And so we wait till it's over, and you don't want to embarrass her about it because it's a nice thing to think. And I said, honey, that's beautiful, but who are our enemies? And she's like, the government, the FBI. And I was like, oh, why is that? And they were like, because they won't let you go to work because you wouldn't get a COVID shot. And they're doing evil things to our family. And you're like, well, she's not wrong. And so when a 5-year-old knows that, now a 7-year-old, she's pretty precocious. So yes, she talks like a 20-year-old because I talk to her just like this. And I give her a hard time and I say wild stuff all the time. My kids always know that I'm joking with them because I'm always joking with them all the time about weird stuff. They're growing up in a world that is a lot faster than when I grew up in the early 80s. Like it just wasn't that hard out there. And we were in the middle of the damn Cold War. Like we had a real enemy. And I think that's a big piece of it. America has forgotten that there is good and evil and that America is supposed to be on the side of good. That's what we signed up to serve, I think. It's like, why are you want to be part of this government? Because I actually believe in the ideal of it, even if nobody else does. Call me naive to be patriotic. But I do actually believe it and I live it. and I carry it out, and I would go to fight for like a woman that I don't know because I think that women should not get beat on by men in public, even if she's being a turd. It's like, well, you don't get to hit her. And if you do, you're going to have to deal with a guy with a beard. And I may not be big enough, but I'm going to try to stop you because that's how I grew up, because I watched Chuck Norris and I watched Sylvester Stallone, and Arnold Schwarzenegger used to be not a crazy person. He blew stuff up and did Commando and went and rescued his daughter. So we used to be this proper country that had an idea of what good and bad was. And was there evil? Of course. And did politicians do bad things? Yes. But if you want to blow your mind, go back and listen to the 1995 State of the Union address by Bill Clinton, where he talks about abortion should be safe, legal, and rare, where he talks about illegal aliens are coming in and stealing jobs from Americans and they cannot be allowed in over the southern border, and we need to lock it down, and we need to figure out how to stop that. Like, go listen to Democrats from the 90s, and they sound like right-wing extremists from today, allegedly. And that's kind of what I do every day on a podcast. It's like, we used to be agreeing on the values of what this country was about, and we disagreed on how to achieve them. And today what we do is we can't even agree on the fundamental facts of biology, let alone values. So forget about trying to figure out a path forward together. And I think it's tragic. And I hope it stops before my kids are old enough to pay attention.
What do you think people should know, especially in the Constitution, that can help them defend themselves against policies like the FBI policies that could harm them?
So I think it's really straightforward. Most people don't know what's in the Constitution when they swear that oath. They don't understand that Congress is supposed to be the superior body, and it's the first article. And the second is where the executive comes in and has some authorities to be able to enact it. And the judiciary is a distant third. They don't understand the mechanics of what we have. And they also don't understand that our Constitution is actually a compromise between two parties that didn't agree on something really, really important. It was the Federalists, which we hear all the time about on the right, and the Anti-Federalists, which is what I am. I'm an Anti-Federalist. I think the federal government is terrible. Why? Because I worked there and I saw it. It wasn't good. It's a bad solution. I tell people the federal government is the worst solution to any problem, including when it's the only solution, which means you should always be skeptical of it. And our founding fathers understood that in some way, and that's why we have the Bill of Rights. And so I would argue that when you swear allegiance to the Constitution, you are rarely swearing fealty to a document that puts Congress as the powers that they have and that they can write the Commerce Clause and interstate and all this other stuff and that they're going to do weights and measures. Like, no. You're swearing allegiance to the thing that is more important, which is that there are God-given rights that pre-exist government. That's the American idea, that you have a right to speech and practice your religion, to be able to go out and assemble with your friends, to petition the government that's been put in for a redress of grievances, that you are allowed to bear arms, and it doesn't say what kind, including a cannon, much to the chagrin of Joe Biden, that you should not have soldiers quartered within your house, that you have a God-given right to your own sanctity of your own dwelling, which is what the Fourth Amendment says as well, that there is due process, that there is a requirement that they cannot be cruel and unusual, and all of the rights. And the biggest ones we forget are the Ninth and the 10th Amendment. And the 10th is the one I focus in on the most. It says, the Ninth says that everything that we list here are not all the rights. So there are other rights out there that exist. And the 10th says, if it's not explicitly stated in this document, then we don't have a right to it as a federal government. The states retain those rights. And unfortunately, the 14th Amendment and that sort of the Equal Protection Clause has been used to subvert the 10th Amendment. But I'd like to see a return to people understanding that the states are supposed to be the functional body of this country, that we're supposed to be a union of states, not this tyrannical federal spider that crushes everybody else and gives out, money whenever it wishes. And if you know that, if you know the federal government is not the source of power, it's not the source of wealth, if you understand the way the system was designed, then you will know that they pre-exist this government. And if you believe that and you act like you are a citizen, I actually saw a lady in Springfield, Ohio the other day, asking her city government, the one that is most accountable to you, the people you'll actually see in your grocery store, most likely. She said, what are we supposed to do? I'm a good citizen and I do what I'm told. No, you must be a good citizen and demand that your government serve you in the way that you require it. That's what's supposed to happen. That's how we have a representative democratic republic. So I think people need to learn civics. So that's what I do in the podcast as well. We try to make civics sexy again because it actually is sexy to know that you have certain rights that pre-exist this garbage system and that we've been slowly kicking the legs out of the chairs over the last 100 years or so. I trace it to like 1913 when we started seeing a lot of downhill slide. They went to a direct election of senators and the income tax. Both of those things fundamentally changed, and the Federal Reserve, obviously, too, which people get excited about. But all of those things change the way that our republic functions. So we're not actually in the founding, institution that our founding fathers gave us. We're in something else. We've gone from the republic to this sort of like empire. Because after 1913, the president became much more powerful, and that happened over a period of time. But by the time FDR was there, he was president for life. So people, if they know their history and they know their civics, they will be able to defend against the things. If you swear allegiance to something, you should probably know what it is. If you declare a religion, you should know the tenets of the religion. And if you're a leftist, that religion is government, and it's awful, and you're my enemy.
Do you think there is any going back to the way the system should be?
I think so. Yeah, I actually do. I talked to a guy yesterday who was he's an expert on sort of like Roman propaganda. Has a master's degree in the sort of the Roman Republic in the fall, and then the empire. And the biggest things that are the issues that happened in Rome, according to him, and I think he's right, were the devaluing of the currency and the destroying of the borders. The difference between us and them. And we are there right now in spades. And they came back from it and managed to go on for another 100 years or so. And we can as well. The difference is that people right now are probably going to have to see a devolution of power from the main source that we continue to give it to the federal government. And we need to see some states that stand up and say, 10th Amendment, we're not going to do that. Yes, we're going to lose federal funding. But you know what? We're not even going to allow you to do IRS enforcement in our states anymore. We don't like it. So we'll collect it on your behalf. The 16th Amendment tells us that you get your income tax, but it doesn't tell us how it has to be done. And we don't agree with it. So we're just not going to collect taxes from the federal government. We'll give it to you when we're done with what we're doing in our state for our roads and for everything else. And that would be big.
So it's the states rising up. Do you think the states are getting there?
I think there are some small states that are going to end up being it. It's not going to be Texas and Florida where it should be. It should be the biggest states that have the biggest populations that just go, I'm done. I'm done with your garbage. What we'll see is a South Dakota or an Idaho or maybe a Montana or a Wyoming. Probably Wyoming might be the best example. Something really small population, because America was meant to be ruled by the people that were closest to you. And when you remember that, then you go like, oh, of course we don't want these. Like how many of your senators care what happens? We know this because we've done it. We've brought our cases to congressmen and to senators, and they don't care. They care about getting elected. They'll run on your messaging. They'll run on the fact that it was a compliance purge in the FBI, and they'll turn around and write a check for it too. So it has to be done more locally. It's probably not even going to be at the state level of like governors, although it'd be nice if they did. It's going to happen in counties that decide to be constitutional sanctuary counties where we believe in the God-given rights, and we're not going to let the FBI come in and do their jam here. And by the way, if people want an action item, because I hate being without hope, the action item is go to your police chiefs, go to your mayors, go to your city councils, and go to your sheriff's departments and have them disengage from federal task forces. The FBI, the DHS, all the animals that exist under DOJ and under DHS cannot do their job effectively and capably. They cannot hit their metrics if you remove the most important thing, which is local cooperation. Just get out of it. Are they going to take a hit? Yes. Tell them you're willing to help push a sales tax locally. You may have to pay for this. And I guess that's the last thing that people should realize. It's going to get bumpy. It's going to get Western. America is a spirit of frontierism and like independence. So if you want to do this, take on some discomfort. I know you have. I know I have. Neither one of us thought we were going to be sitting in front of a microphone doing this jam. It's not what I aspired with my life to do. I thought I was going to be putting guns in bad guys' face and put them in handcuffs. But you go where you're called. And sometimes that call is really, really uncomfortable. Like having your pregnant wife hanging out in your parents' extra bedroom because you have nowhere to live because you sold your house because the government came and took your job. So what? Like I've done it. I'm speaking from a position of strength in this case. You know, I haven't been killed, but I've had my income taken, my job taken, my future, my career, my pension, all of the safety nets. And I've had my kids go live in places where they lost all their friends. We had to sell off our house and move to a place we didn't want to be in. And we didn't have any real say. We lost a lot of agency in that. And then we took the agency back and said, we're still people. We're still human beings. We can discern what our future is going to look like. That's what America's about. It might be uncomfortable and it might cost you a lot. So, you know, tuck in because we're going to need that in a little bit here.
Yep. That was my final question. If there's one thing the average American citizen can do, one thing to combat the corruption, what would it be? And you say, go to your local law enforcement.
And the last thing is personal too, because one of them is external, one of them is internal. The internal thing is draw a line in the sand and do not accept anything less than that from anybody. That might mean you lose friends. It means you lose family members. I've done both. It's okay. I had guys that I helped move. I had guys that I was in their wedding in the Bureau that will not speak to me anymore. So be it. Because if you do the thing that's right, the cost is going to be the cost. You're going to find new allies and new friends. And it might just be you and your family. Turns out husband or wife. You might just be you and your kids and your family and looking around. Maybe you have to go get some chickens to have friends. That's okay. Like independence is the thing that this country is all about. And everybody's going to have a different, ask. Not everybody's going to have to find the line and fight in front of it the same way. Some people will lose a job. Some people will lose their freedom. That's a real possibility for me and my buddies still. And that's okay. It's not great. I'm not thrilled about it, but I've accepted it because that's what it's going to cost so my kids can still be free. So all of the generations before this knew that there was a cost to being American, we're actually having to pay it. We got a big break between like probably the early 80s or maybe the late 70s, all the way until about 15 minutes ago, we got a break in the action where we didn't have to pay a whole lot for anything. We outsourced it to mercenary groups. We gave it to our military. Law enforcement stepped up and did the job of social workers and parents. And so it's like, the bill has come due, folks. It's time to pay it. And that's okay. Just be ready.
Well, Kyle, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for coming on with me today. And thank you for standing up and speaking out.
Of course, no other way to do it.
Thanks so much for tuning in. Please like, comment, subscribe to, and share our podcasts. Visit our website where you can sign up for our latest newsletters and become a member of Feds for Freedom at fedsforfreedom.org.